The issue of transgender athletes competing in women's sports has been one of the most hotly debated topics in recent years. Many people believe that it's unfair for transgender women who have biological features that give them the upper hand over women who were born female can compete in the same league as other women. The issue has reached new heights with the absolute dominance of Lia Thomas, a transgender athlete in the NCAA swimming division. In this video, we'll be taking a look at whether or not trans athletes are an actual threat to women's sports, or if the whole issue is just overblown. The Lia Thomas debacle. The NCAA most recently updated its transgender athlete policy in 2021. It clarified that trans female athletes that are taking medicine to suppress testosterone and other male hormones may compete in the women's divisions of various sports. When they came out with the policy, it was already pretty controversial, but things took a turn for the worse in 2022. Lia Thomas is a female trans swimmer that previously competed in the male division from 2017 to 2019. In that division, Thomas was ranked among the top 100 college swimmers in the country, but nowhere near the top of the charts. All of that changed, though, in 2019, when Thomas started to transition to female. The NCAA had set guidelines for trans athletes to be eligible to compete in women's sports, and by the 2020 to 2021 season, Lia met all of those conditions. Her physical abilities did see a decline after this, and she lost a lot of muscle mass in the process. However, in March of 2022, Lia managed to win the NCAA Division I National Championship, becoming the first trans athlete to do so in any sport at all. The backlash against Lia Thomas. Even though Lia, her friends, and her family were ecstatic about her big win at the championships, the public response was mixed. Some called it a groundbreaking achievement for trans rights, while others said it was just unfair. Lia stands at 6 feet 2, taller than over 99.9% of all women in the United States. But it's not just her height. She has a lot more muscle mass than pretty much every other woman she competes with. She towers over all of her competition, and she looks radically different than all of the other women. Because of this, many people believe that Lia has an unfair advantage over her competitors, most of whom are biological women. There were online campaigns that protested against Lia's win over her competitors, with some outright refusing to acknowledge her as a champion. If Lia had competed in the male division at the same time, she wouldn't have even made the top 10. But in the women's division, she was able to outshine everyone else. Even some traditionally pro-trans outlets were critical of the win, and it quickly became one of the most controversial moments in NCAA history. Do female trans athletes have an unfair advantage? The NCAA regulations and requirements for trans athletes were meant to prevent those athletes from having an unfair advantage over non-trans players. But did it really work? Most detractors say no. According to them, Lia was clearly physically superior to all of the other female swimmers. That's not to take away from Lia's talent, but the difference is clear. If you take a look at statistics from previous games, male swimmers are generally a lot faster and more skilled than female athletes are. It's just basic facts. In a competition between a male swimmer and a female swimmer, both of whom have received the same amount of training, the male swimmer will almost always win. Many people believe that simply because Lia Thomas transitioned to female doesn't mean she's still at the same starting point as other female athletes. She will still always have the physical advantage of being born biologically male. Of course, supporters of Lia and other trans athletes say that the whole transitioning process gives Lia the same starting point as other female athletes. It seems like almost everyone is a biologist these days on the internet, but the NCAA did set up all of its guidelines with the help of science. Let's take a look at what science says about all of this. What does science say about all of this? The issue of trans people in sports is quite recent, which is why there are very few studies done on how much being trans can give athletes an advantage. According to one study done on U.S. military personnel who transitioned during service, trans women generally had the competitive edge over their biologically female counterparts for at least a year. These trans women all underwent testosterone suppressant therapy and feminizing hormone therapy. After 1 year had passed, though, these women started to lose their competitive edge, and they were more or less similar to biologically female soldiers. The gap didn't completely close, though, especially when it came to speed. Trans women, on average, still ran 12% faster than biologically female women. This percentage is significant enough for it to be considered an unfair advantage. To be in the top 10% of the fastest women in the world, you only need to be 29% faster than the average woman. But when it came to other abilities, there was no difference. Trans women were able to do 31% more push-ups before transitioning, but they were at at par with biological females a year after transitioning. With sit-ups, there were similar results. Transitioning does completely change a person from the inside and outside. In many cases, trans women may not have any sort of advantage at all. However, from this study, it's clear that there are cases where trans women may have an advantage over biological women. What about male trans athletes? Most of the discourse about trans athletes is related to trans women. In most cases, trans men get left behind in the conversation. If trans women have an unfair advantage in sports, shouldn't trans men have a disadvantage in those sports? It really just depends on which category trans men compete in. If trans men compete in the women's category, the increased amount of testosterone they'd have would definitely give them an unfair advantage over women. However, if a trans man would compete in the men's category, they wouldn't have enough muscle mass or the bone structure to keep up with the men. This puts trans men in a very strange position. People who are normally opposed to trans people playing in the category of their choice would want trans men to compete in the women's category, but the unfair advantage argument would lose all of its merits. At the same time, trans men would generally want to play in the category they identify with, but keeping up with the rest of the athletes would mean there's almost no chance of winning. Should there be a separate trans category? Because of the ambiguity and confusion surrounding the inclusion of trans athletes of either gender in sports, many people call for a separate category for trans athletes. This would be a division where trans females play against other trans females, and trans males play against other trans males. In essence, it would be the same as the current gender divisions we have, but it would exclusively be for trans athletes. But of course, there are problems with this plan. For starters, segregating trans athletes from so-called regular athletes is not exactly the most progressive thing to push for right now. It would make some trans athletes feel absolutely alienated from society at a time when people say we should be pushing for greater integration for people of all backgrounds. There are also calls to end gender divisions in sports overall. Shooting is an Olympic sport that used to be played by both men and females. Initially, it was dominated by men, but slowly, over time, women started to outshine men in the sport almost constantly. Eventually, the sport was segregated by gender as well. It was an effort to protect men from an unfair advantage, not women. Many people believe that if gender divisions are removed from sports, similar improvements in skills might occur with women in other sports as well. Of course, that's still just a theory. No one knows how it would actually turn out. What do people think? So, at the end of the day, is the general public ready to see trans athletes compete in the team of their choice? According to the most recent polls in the United States, only 37% of Americans were in favor of trans women competing in women's sports. A whopping 63% were against it. The US is, of course, a lot more lenient when it comes to trans rights issues. In other countries around the world, a trans woman competing in women's sports would be almost unthinkable, but it's still important to note that people's attitudes over issues like these can change radically over time. We've seen this with similar issues in the past, but as things seem right now, people seem to be largely opposed to trans women in women's sports around the world. Even Caitlyn Jenner, arguably the most famous trans athlete in history, is opposed to it. It's going to take a lot of time for sports bodies to figure out what to do next. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think trans athletes should compete in women's sports? Let us know in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.